Good evening and welcome to the Northern Rockies Nature Forum. These forums are hosted by the Native Forest Network and the Environmental Action Community and are a series of free community-oriented discussions on the ecology, biodiversity, restoration, and future of natural landscapes in the Northern Rockies bioregion. Tonight's forum is entitled Healthy Forest Policy, an on-the-ground look. And I'm particularly excited about tonight. 2 years ago, we put on the Healthy Forest Initiative panel discussion, thinning the debate. And now tonight we can take a look back and see, because at that time we were trying to figure out what this initiative is going to mean. And now, as the title says tonight, we can take an on-the-ground look and have an idea. The format of the forum will be short presentations, 10 to 15 minutes by each of the speakers, followed by an hour of moderated question and answer from the audience. The next forum, The State of the Grizzly Bear in the Northern Rockies, Recovered or Reeling, will take place Tuesday, November 15th at 7 p.m. right here. Please mark your calendars for this nature forum with the delisting of the grizzly imminent upon us. This will be a chance to hear from the experts on both sides of the coin and really get up on the facts about this. The best way to find out about future forums is to sign the clipboards that will be passed around so we can keep you updated. Tonight we're lucky to have Martin Nye, an Associate Professor of Natural Resource Policy in the College of Forestry and Conservation at the University of Montana, as our moderator. His teaching responsibilities and research interests are in the areas of environmental and natural resources policy, law and administration, with a focus on public lands and wildlife. Nye has a particular interest in natural resource-based political conflict, and his current research agenda examines public lands governance, the political institutions and decision-making processes used to handle difficult policy problems. He received his PhD from Northern Arizona University. Professor Nye is the author of Beyond Wolves, The Politics of Wolf Recovery and Management, and various scholarly articles and law reviews. He is currently writing a book about public lands, conflict, and governance. With that, pass it off to Martin.
Thank you, David. We're going to have 4 presentations, 15 minutes each, and then we'll have an hour or so for questions and comments following all 4 presentations. And so I'm going to keep everybody on their time. I've brought in electric cattle prod underneath the table, so we'll give them a little nudge if they go too much beyond those 15 minutes. I thought we would start off with Maggie Pittman. Maggie Pittman is Ranger District on the Missoula District since May 2004. She was Public and Legislative Affairs Officer in the Helena National Forest from 1991 to 2000. Press Officer for the Northern Region here in Missoula from 2000 to 2003. Deputy Center Manager for the Missoula Technology and Development Center from 2003 to 2004. Maggie?
He forgot all those fun facts to know and tell about that I included, like I'm an ace fisher person, and I know baseball, and Matthew quizzed me today on my baseball skills, and I had to tell him, don't do that tonight. Do not talk about baseball. So I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me, you guys. I thought I'd start out tonight by giving a quick overview of what the Healthy Forests kind of process is all about. In the public arena, it probably is a tad bit confusing as people just hear about the Healthy Forest process, what it all means. So I'm going to take you back just to the fires of 2000 when we thought all was great and moose out here in the west, and in particular right here in Missoula. We couldn't see 5 feet in front of us because the Bitterroot was on fire. After the fires of 2000, you all probably remember the National Fire Plan was instituted, and that had a number of objectives that included things like making firefighter resources available and restoring landscapes after they were burned, investing in projects to reduce the risk of fires, the catastrophic types of fires around communities, and working directly with the communities to prevent that type of catastrophic fire from happening in the future. And then ways for us to be accountable. The National Fire Plan lined out several ways for us to hold ourselves accountable for the money that Congress made available to us. It was a 10-year comprehensive strategy. It was essentially meant to restore and maintain fire-adapted ecosystems. The trouble with it was there were some barriers to implementing that National Fire Plan. And you all may also remember a year or so after that, Dale Bosworth, who of course has been our regional forester, moved back to Washington, D.C., and he had that kind of what I at that time called the buzzword of the process predicament or gridlock or whatever, and that kind of got Congress's ear in my mind. I thought it was a catchy phrase, and it was an easy thing for folks to understand that we were in a bit of a gridlock in terms of how to get projects accomplished on the ground, and some of the processes we had were just plain tough to make things happen. So around that time, those barriers were being talked about, and how we could get things happening on the ground. So given the National Fire Plan, the process predicament, the Healthy Forest Initiative was an administrative act or a piece of policy that ended up happening in 2002. That fire season was am I right, Matt, that was the Biscuit Fire, 2002? That particular season, again, brought lots of emphasis and awareness to the general public about what was happening in the West in these fire-adapted ecosystems. That brought the National Fire Plan and the process predicament together. President Bush created the Healthy Forest Initiative from that. The new tools that came out of that Healthy Forest Initiative included things like the CE authority. You often hear about the categorical exclusion authority that we were given through that piece of work. Those particular authorities allowed us to focus on fuel reduction, post-fire restoration, thinning, salvage, and insect and disease work. All of this was kind of rested on the notion that we would do some work to restore fire-dependent communities. The objectives were simply to identify and remove the barriers to implementing the National Fire Plan and restore the health of our forests. It was an extension of the National Fire Plan. It focused on the part of the National Fire Plan that included restoration treatments and hazardous fuels. The Healthy Forest Initiative also identified a number of areas that could only be restored through legislation. So because of that need for some legislative work, after that came the Healthy Forest Restoration Act. That is what we sometimes hear as HFRA. So you have these three pieces: the National Fire Plan, the Healthy Forest Initiative, and then the Healthy Forest Restoration Act. That was a piece of legislation that provided new authorities and processes that would expedite our restoration goals. It focused on treating hazardous fuels and utilizing biomass to accomplish those restoration goals. It allowed the Forest Service to stay focused on the overarching goal of restoration. And it offers special procedures for EAs, environmental assessments, and EISs, environmental impact statements. It allows us basically to analyze fewer alternatives. What the HFRA does is it gives us an opportunity to look at one action alternative and essentially a no action alternative. It kind of directs us to do a lot more community involvement. Some of you may be familiar with what we call the community fire plans. That's a piece of collaborative work where we engage with the communities that might be affected by some of this buildup of fuels. And we together get around the table before we actually have a proposal on the table for the public to take a look at. And through this HFRA, the Healthy Forest Restoration Act, we hope to be able to sit down ahead of time, work out the alternative that we want to propose on the ground. Before we even get to maps, we collaborate, talk about what is it that we want this area to look like in the future. The bottom line is it's just a different process. We don't have to analyze a wide range of alternatives. A normal NEPA proposal, the National Environmental Policy Act proposal, we have a proposal internally, we go out with a draft to get public input, we get comment back, we kind of mull it over, then we'd send out a decision, a final impact statement or an analysis, and then we give the decision. With the HFRA, we do all that stuff up front, and then we put the proposal together with one action alternative and one no action alternative. So that's kind of the background. Real quick, though, how has this legislation helped us here in Missoula and the Lolo Forest in particular, and on the Missoula Ranger District specifically? It's a little early for us to tell. We have one project on the Lolo Forest right now that's just in the very, very initial stages under the Healthy Forest Restoration Act. It's called the Toboggan Sale. or the toboggan proposal. And you know, we're really creative in the Forest Service. We like to take like 2 or 3 areas and smash them all together and make a name out of them. So this is like Dvorak and what's the other one up there? And Hagen, Dvorak, and we came up with toboggan. So that's what that one is, and I think that's pretty creative of us. So that proposal's on the Superior Ranger District, and we've had many collaborative meetings to date. We still don't have any proposal, nothing real formal on the maps yet. The community fire plan, which is that piece of collaborative work, is already done for this particular project. And what I've been told is there is a bit of community support for this, and they're on a roll. So we're hoping that that one will be able to implement this in a fine fashion. Some of the other things that I believe that this legislation and the National Fire Plan has done, aside from putting in these processes, is it kind of came about at the time when public awareness became really high. You know, when the West is burning up, people are noticing. And people's awareness is, or the people are thinking, what can I do in my private ground, my little backyard here that might be adjacent to public land to reduce the risk of catastrophic fire? So these projects that we've come out of this legislation with, and just the general awareness of it has been heightened in my mind. And I think that collectively we all have a better sense of what we can do together, both on private land and on public land, to reduce the risk of catastrophic fire in these fire-dependent ecosystems. So I'm about done, Martin, and I'm hoping that gives enough fodder for folks to ask some questions with afterwards. Okay.
I'm going to ask Jeff Juel to proceed. Jeff attended Southern Illinois University at Carbondale, where he found not only advanced education opportunities, but the wonders of native forest ecosystems in the surrounding Shawnee National Forest. His scientific training included gaining his master's and specialist degree in social psychology at SIU Carbondale. He moved to Montana in 1985, and by 1990 had moved to Missoula and found himself embroiled in the debate surrounding proposed wilderness legislation that characterized the late 80s and early 1990s. Shortly thereafter, he began volunteering his time with conservation groups advocating for biological diversity, not only in roadless lands, but especially in too often neglected roadless public lands. He has been on staff with the Lands Council, served on the board of directors and on the board of Friends of the Clearwater, and in his 15th year with the Ecology Center based here in Missoula.
Thanks, Martin. Thanks to all you who are attending tonight. Can you hear me all right? And thanks to the organizers. I just wanted a slight correction, Martin. That was emphasis on the roaded national forests, not only the roads, but the roaded. And I hope that becomes obvious as my talk goes on. My role here is to provide you with a historical perspective, very abbreviated, on this healthy forest thing. Some politics, some science, from the unusual perspective on how little we actually know. Aggressive road building and logging on national forests really boomed starting right after World War II. The Forest Service and other government agencies were caught up in what Paul Hurt termed a conspiracy of optimism, meaning the government expected to provide from our national forests all things to all people. Multiple use became a buzzword. And the result of that this is an image of this is kind of the result of that optimism. This is the Kootenai National Forest in the northwest part of our state. Probably, well, no doubt, the most heavily logged national forest in the state of Montana. Although the intensity you see there is found on just about every of the national forest in terms of logging and road building, at least certain sections. Things came to a head in the public eye in the late 1990s when the old growth issue heated up in the Pacific Northwest. It had become debatable whether or not old growth dependent species like the spotted owl were going to be able to persist on our planet. Up to that time, the timber industry and its representatives dominating the agency had largely viewed old growth as merely decadent, slow-growing, and in need of, quote, regeneration. Grudgingly acknowledging the public's new aesthetic, scientific, and spiritual values, the Forest Service was making statements in recognition of those values. So terms such as new forestry and eventually ecosystem management became the rage. By the early 1990s, citizens and environmental groups had become adept at forcing the agencies to face up to their failures to provide all things to all people from our national forests, and administrative appeals and litigation succeeded in dramatically reducing the cut, at least in the Northwest. The timber industry and its supporters in government fought back with a slick public relations campaign that can be summed up in 2 words: forest health. From that day forward, all timber sales were cloaked in the rhetoric of improving, quote, forest health. The trouble is the agency still wasn't learning the science of ecosystems. And I wanted to read this just to kind of make that point. Here. This is something that was brought to the ecologies here several years ago. Okay, so natural vital ecosystem processes such as fires and native tree pathogens, such as bark beetles and fungus, began to be portrayed as catastrophic, unhealthy, and so forth. Contrast that view with a quote from a 1994 paper by Forest Service research scientist Alan Harvey and others. Pests are a part of even the healthiest eastside ecosystems. Pest roles such as the removal of poorly adapted individuals, accelerated decomposition, and reduced stand density may be critical to rapid ecosystem adjustment. In some areas, the ecosystem has been altered, setting the stage for high pest activity. This increased activity does not mean that the ecosystem is broken or dying. Rather, it is demonstrating functionality as programmed during its developmental evolutionary history. Although usually viewed as pests at the tree and stand scale, insects and disease organisms perform functions on a broader scale. So I tried to think of a kind of an analogy to use to represent an ecosystem, and the best I could come up with, just imagine all these objects floating in space, and they're all connected by bungee cords of various thicknesses, lengths, strengths, and all these objects have different motions and functions within this whole. And if you pull on one object, it's all connected. It has an effect. If you cut a bungee cord here or there, it affects everything else. It's this web of life that we don't understand a lot of. Especially beginning in the mid-1990s, continuing to this day, the issue of fire was seen as an opportunity to get people to accept more logging to prevent so-called uncharacteristic fires. The degree and intensity of fires may be higher now, whether from global warming or from fire suppression or both. It's debatable. Also, logging is rehabilitation of burned forests. Wait a minute, not so fast. From the University of Montana's Richard Hutto, a 1995 paper. Fires are clearly beneficial to numerous bird species and are apparently necessary for some. Immediately after a major disturbance event, I detected a large number of species in forests that have undergone stand replacement fires. Several bird species seem to be relatively restricted in distribution to early post-fire conditions. A common Forest Service claim to virtue is to attempt to reproduce, following decades of fire suppression, the forest structural conditions that it considers representative of the range of historic conditions. That is, using thinning and other types of logging to bring the forest to a density of live and dead trees to look at what a forest might have looked like in, say, 1880. A quote from a renowned University of Montana bird researcher, Ryan McClellan, from about 1980 goes as follows. The snags per acre approach, this is post-logging, the snags per acre approach is not a long-term answer because it concentrates on the products of ecosystem processes rather than the processes themselves. It does not address the most critical issue, long-term perpetuation of diverse forest habitats. The processes that produce suitable habitat must be retained or reinstated by managers. Snags are the result of these processes: fire, insects, disease, flooding, lightning, etc. However, to this day, all-out fire suppression remains one of the highest priorities when fires start anywhere in public lands. You see how this operates. Fight fires to set up conditions where the forest is said to be no longer healthy. Then, substitute logging for the effects of fires to increase forest health. Kind of a jobs program for a lot of the industry and the agencies. Unfortunately, what's left out are the natural processes that McClellan talks about, the very things that drive evolutionary change in species adaptation. Our government land managers have a worldview dominated by what I call the manipulate and control paradigm. They don't like the wilderness because the land gets put out of reach of management. And that's obvious from last week, supervisor of the Pittman National Forest. Just put it back up here. Show you again what I'm talking about. The supervisor of this forest decided that in the latest draft of the revised forest plan to govern the whole forest, no recommendation for wilderness outside of what already exists will be made in the forest plan. There are some roadless areas there, but there aren't many, and they don't encompass very much land. But he decided that wilderness was not the recommendation to be. Our land managers embrace and attempt to engender further in our culture fear of natural processes such as fire and insects, a fundamental distrust of the natural world itself. Gail Kimball, regional forester, U.S. Forest Service Northern Region, based right here in Missoula, stated earlier this year at a congressional hearing in Spokane in addressing possible changes to the National Environmental Policy Act. To assess forest health of the national forests and grasses and grasslands in the northern region, one need only drive Interstate 90. Don't look up there. Kimball goes on with quotes like these. As you climb out of Livingston, you start noticing all the dead pine in amongst the very cool rocks in the paths. As you drive into Butte, you fervently hope a lightning bolt doesn't strike anywhere near. Going further west, you'll note acres and acres of burned forest. Keep driving I-90 down the Clark Fork River through Missoula and then on to Superior. There you will see pockets or hillsides of dead trees or trees exhibiting stress as you continue on the path. Perhaps the toughest sight is the big sign, "Welcome to Idaho," with the spectacular backdrop of extensive stands of dead trees. My point here is that the forest health issue is real and the impacts are extensive, she states. The underlying message is not education, not teaching us how to live amidst this wonderful, still somewhat wild forest we find ourselves amongst. No, the underlying message is be afraid. Don't trust the natural world. And most importantly, we, the government, have the solution to these forest health problems. When the doctor has proven to be a politically compromised quack, isn't it time to find another doctor? One that has a much more holistic worldview. I'll finish with a quote from scientists Chris Frizzell and David Bales. This is how I conclude most of my comments on projects Forest Service proposes. Most philosophies and approaches for ecosystem management put forward to date are limited, perhaps doomed, by a failure to acknowledge and rationally address the overriding problems of uncertainty and ignorance about the mechanisms by which complex ecosystems respond to human actions. They lack humility and historical perspective about science and about our past failures in management. They still implicitly subscribe to the scientifically discredited illusion that humans are fully in control of an ecosystemic machine and can foresee and manipulate all the possible consequences of particular actions when deliberately altering the ecosystem to produce only predictable, optimized, and socially desirable outputs. Moreover, despite our well-demonstrated inability to prescribe and forge institutional arrangements capable of successfully implementing the principles and practice of integrated ecosystem management over a sustained time frame and at a sufficiently large spatial scales, would-be ecosystem managers have neglected to acknowledge and critically analyze past institutional and policy failures. They say we need ecosystem management because public opinion has changed, neglecting the obvious point that public opinion has been shaped by the glowing promises of past managers and by their clear and spectacular failure to deliver on such promises. Thank you.
ahead. Since I'm the longer guy,
You should just read it yourself. I'd like to welcome Craig Thomas. Craig Thomas was raised on a farm, and proceeds of the beef operation went to defer the cost of college at the University of Montana in Missoula. As an alumni of the forestry class of 1971, Craig has returned to the U of M to award the Gates Scholarship, which he helped found in memory of a fellow forester. Craig began his forestry career while at school at the Tree Farmers of Missoula as a sawyer and cad skinner, and has worked in many aspects of field forestry, such as timber marking, cruising, sale layout, surveying, logging foreman, logging supervisor, etc. While scaling and later as a processor foreman, Craig developed a log quality program for Champion International that has become the standard for the forest products industry in the Northwest. This program significantly increased the utilization of forest products and standardized the manufacture of logs. Craig has founded a consulting firm and remains as vice president. Currently employed by Johnson Brothers Contracting of Missoula, Montana, Craig is continuing to advance the utilization of forest products. Present operations include in-woods grinding and transportation systems. Craig enjoys hunting, camping, and flying in the Northwest USA.
Thank you. This microphone works?
Yeah.
Since I'm the water guy, I brought a body bag, so the question has to be on the all. Okay? How many students from the University of Forestry School are here, or the conservation? So we got, okay, thank you. I was asked to talk a little bit about my interpretation and understanding of the Healthy Forest Restoration Act. And when we had the political arena changed to where we had a Republican president and a Republican Congress, you'd think that we would be whacking and stacking a lot of trees on the public grounds. I don't see a lot of that happening. What has happened here, what I see anyway, is George Bush introduced the Healthy Forest Initiative and immediately stalled out in Congress. He had about 40% of the votes to pass that. And it just sat there. It didn't go very far. Until congressmen and congresswomen, actually really important women, did a lot of talking with one another, and they talked to their constituents, and they talked to their lobbyists and a lot of other folks, and they came up to modify this to come up with the Healthy Forest Restoration Act. It's a bipartisan act that was heavily supported by the individuals in Congress. So it was passed by a strong majority. Okay? These are the duly elected representatives of the American public, a free enterprise outfit around here. So they're basically representing us. Okay? We elected them to do that. So I would offer for your consideration that George Bush is not the fellow, and the Bush administration is not the fellow. It is a congressional mandate from our representatives that are instructing the United States Forest Service to do something on the ground. And basically this act says go do something. They're frustrated. I don't know that the congressmen are very capable of talking about the different things in forestry and that kind of thing. So basically they have deferred the decisions to the Forest Service. And they have public support to do that. So the next thing I was supposed to talk about was some examples of some of the different projects that I have done, or we have done, and I'll get into that. But first of all, a couple of things that I would like to say, and I would like to address a little bit the diversity on our forest. Okay? And I see that in the active management area, there is a real opportunity for us to address some of the diverse situations that occur out there. Okay? Not some monolithic tree farm all the way across, but there can be some active intervention here and have some pretty good results. And my particular individual philosophy is I don't do a logging job unless, or a harvest job, or a restoration job unless I think that it will do something good for the forest. I try to put the forest first. That gets to be pretty tough when you're in competition with other folks who are trying to do it for the lowest price and all these other kinds of things. So basically what I'm trying to do is put the forest first. If you go up to the Patty Canyon area, now I've done a lot of different things in a lot of different areas, but most of those are locked up. They're private ground someplace, or they're on some company ground, and you can't get there. So I thought for this talk that I should address something that you can go see whether or not I'm baloney or not. Okay? So this is the Pata Canyon Ecosystem Restoration Timber Sale. Okay? It came out of Arnold Daniels and Dave Stack and some other folks in the 95. It was put up. It wasn't bought because it doesn't make a lot of money. This is not a big profit sale. This is where you do a lot of work and you log it basically backwards. Normally you go and cut the biggest trees and leave littler trees. In this particular case, we're treating the smaller timber, medium-sized timber, and leaving virtually all of the large timber. This, let's see how to get this to work here. You might have to give me a little bit of help. Here's a picture. Just do that one. Thank you. It's not as bad as I thought. So this is one of the thinner areas in the sale. It's very heavily stocked. Okay? And to go find this place, here's some of the things that we're doing. We're treating the area with a hot cellar. Ooh, cool, my hot cellar right there. It's a 2628 timberjack, and basically what a hot saw slang term, it is an excavator with a self-leveling cab and boom with a big carpenter saw on it. The carpenter saw has got a 53-inch diameter, cuts a 2-inch curve, it's got 160 horsepower, runs 1100 RPM. It'll cut an 18-inch Douglas fir off in less than 1 second. He actually cuts the tree off, and then he grabs it. So you can't have some wino off the street trying to run this $400,000 car. Okay? He has to be a pretty sophisticated fellow. You see the ponderosa pine tree here that we are trying to reduce the competition of by removing a smaller Douglas fir at the bottom. Smaller Douglas fir at the bottom are about this big around. I like those. This is a good deal. Commercially. Okay? He cuts another tree around it. He goes back and he cuts another tree around it. One of the real advantages of this particular machine is he can pick up the tree so that it is not scraping against or breaking the limbs or doing other damage to the residual tree that you want, and he can set it over into some place where we can skid it through the rest of the trees, minimizing the damage to the residual stand. Okay, so he can move this around basically like Zorro moves his sword. Okay. He sets it off to the side, he set it back here, out of the way of the larger tree. That tree doesn't look to be very large, so I had him get a little bit closer, park the machine, and hike down the hill. He's 5'10". That's a pretty good sized tree. So that's what it looks like when we got finished cutting the other tree. We cut the stumps off about 4 inches high. We tried to cut them off at the surface of the ground using as much of the fiber as possible. If you want to go see whether or not I'm telling you the truth, you could go to the end of the asphalt in Petty Canyon, stop at the sweet smelling toilet, park next to the gate, hike up the road, take a left, or on the left, little left angle, this trail goes up to the left, and right back here you'll see where we were operating, right here. Here's another tree. If you just turn around from that tree and look in the other direction, here's a very nice ponderosa pine, a #1 ponderosa pine. There were never very many #1 ponderosa pine in existence anywhere, but there happens to be one there. That's a 32-foot log with no blemishes on it, 24 inches in diameter, 32 feet off the ground, inside of the bark. There were about 13 trees around it. When we got done cutting around it, this is what it looks like. This is my hard hat. It's a very nice tree. Go up and give it a hug for me, please. Some of the other things that we're doing here, we're skidding down an old trail. Everybody's up there and they're on these trails, okay? Well, if you get to looking at them, they're all a bunch of logging roads. And they've grown up over the last 30 or 40 years. And this particular tree right here is one we're supposed to save, but it's at the edge of the trail, and I'm dragging these trees down here, which are little trees, okay? They're about half the size of the tree that we're trying to save, but they're still a big thing. And they require a lot of energy to get them to where you want to take them. And I'm dragging them around with a 32,000-pound skidder, and the limbs take the bark off of the tree when they go by, so we have wrapped that with a piece of heavy belting and cabled it on there so it'll stay there and protect the tree. What are we doing with the rest? In this particular sale, we can't burn it. The Forest Service can, but I can't. The contract's 7.5 inches thick. It gives you a lot of instructions. Basically, I told my guys, park it out. If you have a question, stop and call me. That's how I reduce 7.5 inches of paperwork to something that guys can use. When we get the limbs stripped from the tree, and we make a peeler log, and a saw log, and a stud log, and a mini stud log, and a pulp log, and then when you get down to just the limbs, the top, we take and we grind it up. And it goes to stone, and it replaces fossil fuel. They have the equivalent 8 megawatt plant out there, and that energy goes back into their plant. So they're diverting the use of electricity, gas, and other things by utilizing this material. For your information there, if you took 1 ton of dry slash, if you cooked it in an oven until it was dry, each ton of dry slash is the equivalent of 3 barrels of diesel fuel. What's a barrel? A 42-gallon barrel is worth, what, $70 now? So that's $210 a ton. This stuff would be equivalent to. And the government's been talking about black gold. Well, we got a lot of green gold around here, and it doesn't have to be very big stuff. It can be all kinds of biomass. These 2 particular machines, this is a Vermeer. You can't see it very well. Mostly you feed the feed machine in the truck behind it. This one's a track bandit. In both cases, the engineers came to our job, Johnson Brothers, and we showed them the different things that we wanted on the new machines. So the engineers came out here, designed the machine to fit our specifications, come back, you can now buy them on the market with the particular items that we talked to them about. That particular machine, I saw the purchase order on it was $494,000. This one was about $440,000. Blow it in a chip van, goes into town. If you're going to do it, and this doesn't show up very well, this is a prescribed fire, and you can't see it here, but right there and right there, what happened is they run a prescribed fire on Lake Como and burn and kill 60% of the standing timber. And my point here is that if you're going to reintroduce fire into it, you better do some mechanical treatment beforehand, because there's just too much stuff there. Does this restoration stuff work? I didn't quote any scientific peer-reviewed fellows in here because I've done enough projects that I don't need to do that. I can refer back to the project that I have successfully completed. It's really nice to have some backup, but you can stand alone on some of these things. This particular area here is on Burnport Ranch. You can't get there. They own 8,000 acres. They have 1,000 acres of timber. We treated it. I worked on the ranch, or we worked on the ranch for 2 years. The instructions that we had were park it out and work with Bill. That was my instructions. They watch us every day, but we went around and did what we thought was best for the forest. Had a lightning strike occur right there. Gold 1 fire is right here. We had already completed this thinning in this area in here. 40-mile-an-hour winds from the southwest. 4 borate drops. A Sikorsky Sky Crane and a Huey. 2 fire crews. They couldn't stop it. It got in the thinned area and it went to the ground. And I talked to Tobin Kelly from the Stevensville Ranger District, 777-5461. And he said that without the road, they sprayed this down with some foam there, and without the thinning, they would not have been able to stop this. So they happened to be in the right place at the right time, but we have happened to help at that particular time. So that worked out pretty well. I was proud of that. So I have a solution, and it's our solution. And what it is that the places that we don't, how much time have I got?
I don't know how much of a moderator tonight. How about 5 minutes, 7 minutes?
Okay. Is that okay? Oh, yeah. I have a solution. What I'm finding here is that I don't get to work on the federal timber very often. Okay, and when I do get to work there, or when we get to work there, the contract's 7.5 inches thick. I don't get to make a decision. Okay, it's all done. Everybody's planning this out. Every square foot, every single tree, every plant, where I'm going to drive, what I'm going to do, what time it's going to occur at, has already been made as a decision. When I make the prescriptions, or we make the prescriptions on the private ground, we interact with the private landowner. All right? And we come up mutually, we negotiate to some kind of a, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, we're going to do something else. Okay? And what I propose here is that the Forest Service should do a project. Now they do 4,000 acres. And then somebody else who's written an alternative, in this case, and we just go to the bidders here, there's an alternative 3, is that right, Matthew? Yeah. Let those folks do their alternative. And I wrote an alternative. And I'd like to do 4,000 acres too. And I think we should all get together and go out there and see in a certain time frame, ecologically and economically, what it looks like. And it should be open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to the public. They should be able to come up here and look at us with a microscope on what we're doing and see whether or not they think that it is an appropriate process. I guess that's all I have this evening. So, David, how do I shut it off?
Okay, last but not least is Matthew Koehler, Director of the Native Forest Network, a conservation organization whose mission is to protect and restore forests and wild places. He has been working on forest issues for the past 10 years. In 1999, Matthew co-founded the National Forest Protection Alliance, which today is a national grassroots coalition of 130 conservation groups from around the country working to protect and restore America's national forests. In addition to being a certified high school English and history teacher, he paid his way through college by working at his cousin's lumber company in Wisconsin and spent a summer as a wildland firefighter in Oregon.
All right, thanks for turning out tonight and coming to the panel on the Healthy Forest Initiative and the Healthy Forest Restoration Act. There's been a lot of rhetoric about the Healthy Forest Initiative and the Healthy Forest Restoration Act. I myself am probably guilty of some of that rhetoric. I just thought I'd start the night with a somewhat comical editorial cartoon about what this editorial writer thought about Bush's Healthy Forest Policy. What I'm going to do is take a look at the Healthy Forest Initiative, and I thought Maggie did an excellent job of really talking about what the Healthy Forest Initiative was, a series of policy positions put in place by the Bush administration administratively. And then I'm going to talk about the Healthy Forest Restoration Act, which was the law passed by Congress that both Maggie and Craig talked about. And then we're going to take a look, an on-the-ground look at how are some of those policies playing out on the ground. So real quickly, again, the Healthy Forest Initiative is not one specific policy or one specific piece of legislation. In fact, as Maggie mentioned, it encompasses really the Bush administration's approach to forest policy. In 2003, one of the sort of main legs, one of the main pillars of the Healthy Forest Initiative was the categorical exclusion rules that were put into place. Those rules in the July 7th ruling of this year have been curtailed significantly because a judge found that the Forest Service really did not have the authority to limit the public review process and to have no public appeals process on these projects. And you can see the types of projects that we're looking at that are being performed under the categorical exclusion rule. 70 acres of green tree logging, 250 acres of post-fire salvage, and 1,000 acres of fuel reduction logging. There's also a provision in there for 4,200 acres of prescribed burning. And kind of like how Craig pointed out on that Lake Como fire, it's interesting to note that if you're a homeowner in the wildland-urban interface under these rules, and if the Forest Service wanted to initiate a prescribed burn literally in your backyard on Forest Service land, under these authorities, you would, as a member of the public, have no opportunity to appeal that project. Your only recourse would be to take the federal government to court, which is a daunting task to say the least. Some of the other proposals that fit under the Healthy Forest Initiative was the Bush administration scrapping of the Sierra Nevada framework. They are calling for a tripling of logging on the 11 national forests in the Sierra Nevada of California, opening up spotted owl reserves to logging under the guise of fuel reduction, and allowing trees up to 8 feet in circumference to be logged under the guise of fuel reduction. They dropped the Tongass National Forest, America's largest national forest up in Alaska, from the roadless area conservation rule. We all also do realize that they've they're in a process of really rewriting that roadless rule. But specifically to the Tongass, what it means is in the next 10 years, they have 50 ancient forest timber sales in roadless wildlands. And as you can see, there's enough trees there, 1 billion board feet of trees in those timber sales, which would be enough to fill 200,000 log trucks lined up for about 1,700 miles, which would approximately be Missoula to Seattle, back to Missoula, back to Seattle, and then a little jaunt up the Willamette Valley. They also dropped 144 species from protections under the Northwest Forest Plan, which covers the Pacific Northwest. They dropped ESA Section 7 consultations. They're attempting to gut the National Forest Management Act regulations. And as I mentioned, the roadless rule roadblock. During the question and answer period, if anyone has any more questions about these specific components of the Healthy Forest Initiative, we'd be happy to answer questions, I'm sure. The Healthy Forest Restoration Act is also often confused with the Healthy Forest Initiative. All of those previous policy changes that I highlighted, those were actually done administratively. Whether it's the Clinton administration or the Bush administration, the executive branch is allowed to do certain things and to do certain rulemaking administratively. Congress did pass the Healthy Forest Restoration Act. I will point out that it wasn't going to pass the U.S. Senate. The California wildfires of October 2003, 90% of those were arson fires. 85% of those did not burn on federal land. They primarily burned chaparral and scrub in the area of Southern California. But the California wildfires really kind of spurred the U.S. Senate to pass the Healthy Forest Restoration Act. As you can see, it was signed in early December of '03, almost 2 years ago. It would have been interesting to see those members of Congress say we need to pass the Healthy Forest Restoration Act so that 2 years down the road we still don't have one Healthy Forest Restoration Act project implemented anywhere in the country. So to date, not one project has been implemented anywhere in the country. The first Healthy Forest Restoration Act project in Montana and the Forest Service's northern region is here on the Bitterroot National Forest, and it's the Middle East Fork Hazardous Fuel Reduction Project on the Bitterroot National Forest. I'm going to now take a look on the ground at what we're seeing within those logging units, proposed logging units on the Middle East Fork project. We found out about this project actually in fall of last year, and immediately upon finding out about this project, we began going out into the forest. We've conducted dozens of monitoring trips out on the forest. We've taken over 200 people out into the forest to take a look at these projects. We've held community meetings about this project in Sula and Hamilton and Missoula. We've held public science panels with some of the region's experts, PhD scientists in Hamilton and Missoula. And what we found when we've gone out into the Middle East Fork project is we've really found a forest that has been experiencing some bark beetle activity over the past couple of years. There's a couple of reasons for that. First and foremost would be the sort of warm, dry period we find ourselves in. Douglas fir bark beetle prefers warm and dry periods, as does mountain pine beetle. But what we've also found is people should understand these Douglas fir bark beetles, they don't hit small diameter Douglas fir trees. It would be rather interesting if we could, through modern science, almost get the Douglas fir bark beetles to maybe just focus on dog hair thickets of Doug fir and could kind of do the thinning for us. But the Doug fir bark beetle will typically hit Douglas fir trees that are what most people would consider old growth or large diameter trees. Some of the trees out there we've measured to be 4 feet in diameter. A lot of these Doug fir trees that have been hit by bark beetles are well over 200 years old. They are either dead or are dying. Some of the Douglas fir trees, the large ones, are surviving the beetle infestation. But what we're finding throughout the forest is just these large trees. And with the Forest Service's proposal under the Middle East Fork Hazardous Fuel Reduction Project, we see 3,800 acres of primarily old-growth mature forest of primarily Douglas fir, some ponderosa pine mixed in some areas, that are slated for industrial logging as part of this Healthy Forest Restoration Act project. Many of these areas are far from the immediate surroundings of the community, but are over a couple ridge tops. These forests are anywhere from 5,500 to 6,500 acres in elevation. Many of them are north to east facing slopes, which means it's a much wetter climate. I guess the point I want to make is what we're finding is these are not ponderosa pine dominated stands where we have thickets of Doug fir coming in, but clearly these Doug fir trees that we see here have been here for a long time. We're also seeing that there is a need to do something in this area. We are seeing a tremendous need for restoration, and I'll get to that in a minute. And we're also seeing that here we do have a ponderosa pine tree. We're actually on a big slope here, so we are measuring that tree at about breast height. We're just on probably about a 35-degree slope. But we're seeing an example of 7 or 8 inch diameter Doug fir trees that I don't think anyone would have a problem with some of these trees being removed in the form of fuel reduction. Now, we might have a problem about how we're going to do that. I know a lot of us, especially on steep slopes, would have a problem with the heavy equipment that Craig pointed out on what they're doing on the Patty Blue project, but no one's saying that we can't do something to reduce fuel in this area. We see evidence, this is within Unit 13, we see evidence of tip-up mounds, and as Jeff Juel talked about, these natural processes that are in place. These Douglas fir trees, once they die, the standing snags, even if they're up for 2 or 3 or 5 years, some of them will be up for 10 years. They're very important for critters. The bird activity out there, especially the woodpecker activity, is absolutely amazing, especially during the winter months. And then a lot of these Doug fir trees will become tip-up mounds, which are very important as far as microsites in the forest, as far as a denning habitat for marten and other critters in the forest as well. One of our concerns is if we go out and log a bunch of these old-growth Douglas fir trees, the 2 to 4 foot diameter trees, what is the future of this forest? What is this future forest going to look like? Here we're out with a bunch of scientists from the University of Montana School of Forestry. We're out there with 2 PhD entomologists. We're out there that day with a soil scientist, fuel specialist, and some other people from the School of Forestry. Just again, poking around, getting out on the ground, which is what we really like to do, a lot of monitoring, to really look at what's going on out on the forest and with this proposal and other proposals. One of the things that we're finding in the Middle East Fork project area, and I'll talk in a minute about the roads, the project area has 200 miles of roads, 5.2 miles of road per square mile. Most experts will say you want the limit, the upper limit you want to be at is about 1.5 miles of road per square mile. The entire East Fork drainage of the Bitterroot, we should understand how heavily logged this area is, especially from the 60s and early 70s. In fact, the National Forest Management Act, which the Bush administration is currently rewriting the regulations for, that bill was passed in 1976, largely because of the Bitterroot clear-cutting controversy up the East Fork of the Bitterroot that occurred in the 60s and 70s. The East Fork River drainage has almost 1,500 miles of roads just within that drainage. So we do see a tremendous road network out there, and we see that these roads continue to dump sediments into streams. What we're looking at here is within the Middle East Fork project area, and this is Guidey Road, Road 311. This is going to be, if the Forest Service proposal goes through, this is going to be a major haul route. They have done these BMP, Best Management Practices upgrades, which I would point out are highly touted. They're doing it in anticipation of this project going forward. What we see, though, is this was the spring, and you can see right along here some sediment, which is running right into the creek. And again, these were best management practices that had happened a few months before, and we didn't have an incredibly wet spring. So one of our concerns is, what is the log truck traffic going to do as far as increasing sedimentation? We're also seeing elk. The biggest elk herd in western Montana is found in the East Fork of the Bitterroot River. Everywhere we go, we find signs of elk tracks, herds of elk. It's also one of the largest herds of bighorn sheep in western Montana. In fact, when we were monitoring the sales last November, the amount of hunter traffic up there is absolutely incredible. I know a lot of people here in the Missoula Valley value the East Fork of the Bitterroot as far as recreation, hunting, and fishing. The other thing, again, that we find throughout this project area, this is proposed Unit 17, right next to a previous clear cut. These are some units in the Culvert Creek drainage, right next to a clear cut from the late 80s, early 90s. This is the Bertie Lord drainage, which is in the project area. This is an interesting shot because this was actually logged in 2003 as part of the Bitterroot National Forest Burned Area Recovery Plan. This area right here was a large clear cut that was logged in the mid 80s. And then this right here, you can see through the shadows that a lot of the overstory trees, the large Doug fir, have been hit by bark beetles in there. But this is proposed for a regeneration harvest, which is a very heavy-handed industrial logging approach. And again, one of our concerns is, what is the cumulative impact of what the Forest Service is proposing? Again, we've been trying to do what we can to work with both community members in Sula, people throughout the Bitterroot Valley, and the Forest Service to come up with a common sense proposal out in for the East Fork project. Again, we've held meetings, we've held field trips, we've gotten people on the ground to take a look at what the Forest Service is proposing. A lot of people have heard about the controversy around the fact that the Bitterroot National Forest in April 22nd, released the draft environmental impact statement for this project to the public. That was on a Thursday or a Friday. By Monday of the next week, while the draft project was being released to the public, and the public was told to review and comment on this draft project, the Forest Service and Supervisor Dave Juel, who's actually in the audience this evening, he sent out marking crews to begin marking the logging units based on the Forest Service's preferred alternative before a decision was made and during the public comment period. In fact, Mr. Juel just sent me an additional information that we requested through the Freedom of Information Act. Just got it yesterday. And the Forest Service, marking trees to be cut, they've already spent $208,000 marking trees to be cut as part of this project. Not on the analysis. They've spent almost $50,000 on spray paint, and they've spent that much on marking crews, almost $250,000, and a decision hasn't even been made yet. This is a forest that has a $16 million maintenance backlog of promised watershed and road restoration work from the Bitterroot Burned Area Recovery Plan following the 2000 wildfires. The proposal that we've put forth, which I'll talk about in a second, would cost about half a million dollars. It would, look at the work that we could have done as far as watershed restoration or actually fuel reduction if we could spend this $200,000 plus doing fuel reduction work. Now, I'd like to point out that these trees right here are not going to be logged. One thing that has upset us, in addition to the $200,000 being spent by the Forest Service, is what we're finding that they're doing is they're actually going out and marking the trees that are going to stay. We've been told they're doing this because the trees that are going to stay are less than the trees that they're going to log. In other words, it would cost more money to mark the trees that they're going to log because more trees are going to be logged than are going to stay. So what we see here is this is one of the sort of rare stands of ponderosa pine that we've seen. 200 to 300-year-old ponderosa pine trees have essentially been defaced and vandalized by the Forest Service. They've been marked. They're not going to log them, but now we're going to go out, and what we're going to see once this project goes forward is we're going to see stumps and spray paint out in the forest. Again, this is not
you're at your 15 minutes.
Okay. May I have another couple minutes? Did Mr. Thomas have a couple minutes extra? Okay, thank you. So this is one of our concerns that we're seeing out there. This is the alternative that we put together. We put together this alternative with Bitterroot Valley residents. We put together this alternative with current and former loggers, with Forest Service employees, former supervisors of the Forest Service, former wildlife biologists, former district rangers. I will mention that much to our chagrin, we had a whole watershed and road restoration component of our alternative. Unfortunately, Supervisor Bull eliminated that from our alternative. We feel it's amazing that we can have a Healthy Forest Restoration Act that the Forest Service claims watershed and road restoration work, unless it's tied directly to logging, is not covered under the Healthy Forest Restoration Act, which was a surprise to us. But our alternative would include almost 1,600 acres of fuel reduction on Forest Service land. This is an alternative being supported by the environmental community. About 600 acres immediately around structures within 400 meters of structures. 1,000 acres outside of that area. According to the Forest Service, $1 million and 45 jobs generated in the local community as a result of this alternative. And look at what the way some in the logging industry are portraying it. They're portraying our alternative as no action on the forest except for a small amount of work done around houses and raking needles from under decks. Again, 1,600 acres of fuel reduction work being supported by the environmental community, and I'd add, being supported by everyone down there in the East Fork community. Sure, some people in the East Fork community would like to see more work done, but everyone seems to agree we at least want to see this work done. Here are some maps, again, of the project area showing you how heavily logged and roaded some of these areas are. I'd like to just address some of our concerns with the Forest Services project. Again, 33% of the area has already been logged, 200 miles of roads in the project area. You can see that there's 1,500 miles of roads in the East Fork drainage, about 1,700 stream crossings. The East Fork of the Bitterroot is a 303 listed stream with a TMDL. What that means essentially is no further degradation of the East Fork of the Bitterroot River can occur. According to the Forest Service's EIS, from harvesting activities, we'd have an additional 9 tons of sediment annually dumped into the streams. We'd have an additional 58 tons of sediment per year as a result of log hauling. Again, one of our concerns, industrial logging of almost 3,000 acres of mainly unlogged mature forest. One of our concerns with the Forest Service is they don't seem, an area can be an old growth forest, but if a fire comes through, it's no longer old growth. If insects come into the forest, it's no longer old growth. Apparently dead and dying trees are not a component of an old growth forest to the Forest Service. Any researcher, any scientist will tell you that dead, dying, blown off tops, all of that sort of stuff is an essential part of a healthy forest. Soil quality is a big issue. We just filed our objection on this project. I will point out that in the FEIS, the Forest Service has purged 28 important documents regarding soils that were in the DEIS and now are no longer in the FEIS. But 20% of the treatment acres are in areas that already exceed the Forest Service's own soil standards. I guess I should probably stop, and I was going to point out some of the other projects that we're looking at. These are CE projects on the Clearwater National Forest, categorical exclusion projects. This is Fort Neer CE project up Mill Creek near Frenchtown. These were all projects that were done with no public appeals process and limited environmental review. Again, soil damage is one of the big issues that we see on the forest. You can already see ATV traffic and motorcycle traffic is using some of these log skid trails immediately following the logging. Other CE projects that we're seeing throughout the West, this is the Santa Fe National Forest, blue trees to be cut. San Bernardino National Forest, this is a CE project. Another CE project on the San Bernardino. We have the Healthy Forest Restoration Act. Just like we had the Patriot Act and now we have the Patriot Act 2, we're giving a Healthy Forest Restoration Act 2 It's going to be introduced in Congress any week. In fact, we thought it was going to be introduced about 8 or 9 weeks ago. It's being introduced by congressional members from Oregon. They're using the post-fire logging that they've done on the Biscuit timber sale in southwestern Oregon as the poster child to call for a further curtailment of environmental reviews, to really mandate following any disturbance, whether it's fire or whether it's insects or blowdown or hurricanes. The Forest Service needs to go in and do post-disturbance logging followed by replanting. This is along the Babyfoot Lake trailhead into the Kalmiopsis wilderness area. This was illegal logging that the Forest Service actually did of an area that's set aside for rare brewer spruce on the Biscuit project. This is what post-fire, this was logged in 2005 on the Siskiyou National Forest. So again, I guess I've gone over, which I kind of knew I would. You know, this is an example of some ecologically based fuel reduction work that we did up near Ovando on the Lolo National Forest. We're actually doing a lot of work with the Lolo National Forest and have a much different relationship with the people on the Lolo than we do on some of the other national forests. Again, this was an example of, this is some common ground. Getting boots on the ground, not getting heavy equipment on the ground, but doing some fuel reduction work around communities. This is an example of, we're doing work. Maggie mentioned the DeHagen project out on the Lolo National Forest near Dvorzhia. The Native Forest Network and the National Forest Protection Alliance, we've been in there since the get-go, working with the community. NFN actually just wrote a $10,000 grant and received a grant from the National Forest Foundation to do work on private lands, to do thinning work, to help some of the elderly folks in that area, and to do a community wildfire protection work weekend in that area. And this is an example of some collaboration that we see working pretty well. Again, compared to the Bitterroot National Forest and their version of collaboration under the Healthy Forest Restoration Act, which appeared, according to the FEIS, their collaboration started with and ended with a September 29th, 2004 meeting down in the Sula community. The Lolo National Forest has been doing a great job of collaboration with the moderator, Jim Birchfield, who's in the audience from the School of Forestry, getting 75 to 100 people at some of these meetings and out in the woods to look at some of these projects. So people are interested in going in this direction.
And then I don't have a microphone, but you've been up there long enough. I think I'll give other people a chance.
Okay, well, the moderator could have cut me off at any time, sir.
He tried to.
Yeah,
Well,
I think in all
okay.
fairness, I think it is
Yeah.
time to wrap it up.
Okay, I was
Let's
just
get
waiting.
up
I was
there.
just
It's
waiting.
about 10 or 15 minutes.
I'm not sure about that, but if you would have cut me off, I would have been happy to do that. So.
Well, we still have 45 minutes to an hour for questions and comments, and I thought you guys are anxious to get engaged, so instead of having an exchange among panelists, why don't we just open it up if that's okay with everybody. I can do my best Donahue impersonation and walk down the halls and listen to your concerns, or you could just shout them out yourself.
Okay, this question is for everybody, and I'm a student in the College of Forestry and Conservation, and I hear terms, somewhat esoteric terms, but healthy, as in healthy forests, restoration, catastrophic, industrial logging, and it seems to me that people are operating along. They're using different definitions of these terms, and thus there's not full communication going on. So I'd just like to hear how each of the stakeholders, as it were, define some of these terms: healthy, restoration, and catastrophic.
And then let me just point out that the Healthy Forest Restoration Act does not define the term healthy forests, which a lot of people find interesting. So what a great question to get started.
Well, I would say this about restoration, and that would be to me, that means mostly removing the human caused impediments to natural recovery.
I'd like to address that, and let's go to the Bitterroot. 49% of the forest is wilderness. 26% is unroaded. It's 4 districts. So what's that, 25% divided by 4, that's 6%. And on the Sula, they're talking about addressing about 20% of the district. And they're talking about addressing 10% of that. This is a little bitty thing. And the forest has been divided up into different zones. There's a wilderness zone, and as Jeff talked about the wilderness, that's what his fits. And then there's an active management area and an unroaded area, okay? So you're looking at different things, and what you would say in one thing does not necessarily fit the other zone. So if you're talking about a 4-foot Douglas fir tree in the wilderness area, it would be a legacy old growth tree. In the active management timber base, it's a crop tree. That is the coarsest view of it.
So what you're saying is there are multiple different definitions for different parts of the forest?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And then there's different interpretations within each one of those. Okay.
So where does just a citizen who's not a student of natural resources kind of go to make sense of all this?
To the woods.
I honestly don't know.
Well, I enjoy having the opportunity to have folks that are mom and pops, students, people on the street. I'm often referred to as the Forest Service lady. And I do get questions like that, exactly what you're asking. And it really is a pleasure and an honor to be able to explain in terms that make sense to me to people like folks that I meet on the street and in the grocery store. And when people ask me things like, what do you mean by restoring? I speak to things like balance and health and an ecological kind of a mix that would make sense to folks, so that a lot of people in this area anyway, in this part of the country, understand what that means because they are familiar with hunting and fishing, and to them that has a certain connotation. So try to keep it in those terms.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if I'll just say one more thing, and I just haven't heard definitions really from anyone who's spoken so far. You know, if you study economics or ecology, I mean, you really have to state your assumptions in any of these natural or social sciences. So from a citizen perspective, you know, I just think that for any stakeholder group or any management perspective, it really helps if you get, as a consumer of information, good qualifications as to what are the assumptions here, when we say something like healthy, what are the criteria we're using? Healthy for whom or for what? And I guess that's what I'm getting at, and I'd still love to hear specific definitions if people have them.
Well, I'll take one more stab at it. I think that's a good question. One word that seems to be avoided a lot in our society but really needs to be used and explored and defined is what is sustainable. And we know that picture of logging that I showed in the slide certainly wasn't sustainable because they are not able to cut that many trees in that quick a time as they have. So what is sustainable on a land base that's already been cut over like that? It might be not doing any logging or doing very little. How can a human community, be sustained when the ecosystems are falling apart or when they're severely damaged? I know I'm asking more questions, but I think that's the best I have is if we can't really explore the sustainability issue and how can we sustain those ecosystems, we all depend on them, then we don't stand a chance over the long term.
May I try again? Sure. I guess what you're asking is, I spent 5 years in the forestry school here. And there's a lot of books, okay, and you're basically asking for a summary of that, and I can't do that here, okay. But I would be willing, if you would like to come with me and spend the day, and then I could show you some individual spots. And in all fairness to Jeff, I think if you were to go with him for a day, he could show you those things too. And it's difficult in this classroom to try to envision what you're saying there. Okay, and I'm at a severe disadvantage because I'm not a classroom type person. Okay, so if we went on the ground, and you would probably get a different view from Jeff than I have, but you would probably understand both of us better if you were able to go and see the points.
Now, did you want to speak to this? Or?
Can I?
Yeah.
I thought Jeff gave an excellent definition of restoration, actually, which I share. So I'll leave it at that. You know, when we look at ecologically based restoration, which we're doing a lot of, and I know it's a buzzword, we are looking at restoring natural processes and removing the impediments to a naturally functioning ecosystem. And everything is based on a site-specific example. In some areas, maybe you do have a pea pine, low elevation forest that hasn't seen a fire for a while. Maybe some of these small Doug fir trees are an impediment to a naturally functioning ecosystem. In somebody's definition, it might be. I think we do need to recognize in the history of the Earth, we've probably gone in a ponderosa pine ecosystem 100 or maybe 150 years without a fire, because that sort of stuff happened. We've had climatic changes and changes in the landscape that have stretched a lot longer than when white people started coming out west. So I agree that the definitions are few and far between, and sometimes we seem to argue about, I thought you did a good job with healthy forests. Well, healthy for what and healthy for whom? That's a question we ask. Those forests in the East Fork, Dr. Dick Hutto, who people might know is a recognized expert on ornithology here at the University of Montana, he says about the Middle East Fork, well, it seems pretty healthy for beetles, seems pretty healthy for woodpeckers. We've gone down there, we've seen plenty of elk, plenty of bighorn sheep, we've seen those animals, mule deer. They don't seem to be having a problem with what's going on out there. From a human perspective, maybe some of us might think it's not a healthy situation. So there's always site-specific examples, and I think from a human perspective, we're always going to bring our own prejudices to the table as well. So that's probably why it's hard to come up with a definition that everybody could agree on. We could give a definition of old growth. For example, we probably couldn't come up with a 1 or a 2 sentence definition that everyone would agree with on that as well.
And before it is interesting to note that we started with this Landsat image of the Kootenai National Forest, and it wasn't that long ago, getting at the heart of this matter, maybe the degree of human management of our natural resources, that not too long ago, the Kootenai used that as their public relations poster, a working forest. And now, you know, it's in every environmental slideshow in the state I go to. So it's like we're looking at the same images and we're seeing very different things, perhaps. I don't know. Yes?
There seems to be a difference of opinion as to what should be done with these large, old-growth Douglas fir that are infested with the Douglas fir bark beetle. Could you tell me what would be the consequences of leaving those trees intact and not logging them? And who is this for? Well, this is for all members of the panel, because I'm just wondering what would be the consequences of leaving them intact, and what would be the consequences, on the other hand, of cutting those old-growth bark beetle-infested trees.
I can begin. We have a couple little pockets of this as an example on the Missoula district in the Rock Creek area, where we've got the Douglas fir bark beetle that's infesting the trees up there. Have you been up there recently?
No.
And if you were to head up into Rock Creek, you can see some of the effects of the beetle outbreak in that area. And our thought is that you can't ever chase the beetle. You can't ever get ahead of it in terms of staying on top of it. But if you're able to manage the forest and remove some of the trees and do some work with some of the pheromone caps that we've been putting on trees, and Ken Gibson's, who's in the audience, is our entomologist. He's going to go, Maggie, you're really embarrassing my science here by trying to talk in layman's terms, but pardon me for that. But we try to attract the beetles to certain trees and to make them think that these trees are full up. There's no more stuff here for them to come and eat, so they can go elsewhere and stop infecting those trees. And so in some places we're taking out the trees in Rock Creek where there's hazards that are happening. But if we left the trees there, my understanding is that we'd be having more of an outbreak into that area, and we'd eventually have it at risk for fire and catastrophic kind of events that we may not want to have, and more insect outbreaks. So you may be able to get a lot more information about the insect and disease kind of thing that we'd be looking at in the Doug fir forest here from other folks in the audience. But that's the type of thing that we get concerned about. Craig, you may be able to speak more to it too from the forester perspective.
And, okay, you wanted it delineated pretty closely. You're talking about a Douglas fir tree, okay? You got 2 Douglas fir trees, same size, same thing, everything, okay? One in the wilderness and one in a logging area, okay? You leave the tree in the wilderness, okay? It has a lot of natural values there for the woodpeckers, for the bugs, for all kinds of things that's going to fall down, recycle into the earth, and those kind of things, okay? If you take it over on the logging side, you're going to harvest it and you're going to turn a buck. You can put it in your pocket, you can reinvest it in the forest. But the woodpecker's not going to peck on it. Okay, so you're making a trade-off. For each thing that you do, there's an equal and opposite reaction. You're going to benefit one and not benefit another. So what do you want to do? It's a societal question. I mean, the earth is going to be fine in either case. You can have more woodpeckers one way, less woodpeckers the other way. What do you want to do?
So you say the costs and benefits are about equal, leaving them more cutting.
Well, I don't know that. I mean, the Earth's going to be here for a long time. It was here when I showed up. It's probably going to be here when I go away. And I guess it's a value judgment on what you, as society, want to do with that. Now, what we've done here is we've zoned these different areas out. Leaving it is in the wilderness, a roadless thing, all right? And there is the possibility of harvesting in an active management area. If you cut it, you can make some money on it. Sometimes, not all the time, okay? And then you could reinvest that or put it in your pocket, or I don't know, whatever you want to do with it. You could take the boards and make a house. It's a house for the birds if you leave it out there. Well, what are you going to do, okay? So I guess that's for you to decide, not me. I'm Tim the tool man. You point me in the direction. I got the whacker and stacker thing, okay?
Yes. I'm very appreciative of the science and professionalism of the panelists, but to me, this initiative is pure politics. I spent my career in urban planning, and I went through the Reagan era with James Watt, et cetera. But in the urban planning realm, this sounds so much like the highway building era, where just as there were trees marked before decisions were made, there were houses marked to be removed before decisions were made. And I think that we need to look at this realistically, and especially for all the young people in the audience, they need to get a little bit of history. That using words that sound good but have a different purpose need to be exposed. There used to be, in the Reagan era, something called suburban mobility for transit. It was really a way to steal the money from Philadelphia and New York and San Francisco and Los Angeles and put it in an area where it couldn't be used because everybody was driving. So we really do need to look at first the words and then the actions. What is going on in the Bitterroot? Looking as a 35-year urban planner and looking at process is outrageous. To throw an 80-year-old man out of a public meeting, to mark the removal of trees before a decision is made about which trees are going to be removed is outrageous. And people need to react to that, and they need to react politically. I don't expect any reactions, especially from Maggie, who has to keep a job with the Forest Service, but this is a political act that is taking place, and we ought to address it politically. So if anybody wants to respond, fine, but I want to make that point.
Yeah, but politically, I think it's disgusting We have a forest out here. Are we going to do something in the forest? We have an active management area. Are we going to do something there or not? If we're not, that's fine. Let me know. I'll go someplace else. Okay? I'm not into this political stuff. I can't survive doing that as a forestry person if I'm not going to utilize my tools or my expertise there. If you don't like the way Patty Canyon's going on, drive up there and have a look-see. Drive to the end of the asphalt and hike out there. You don't like it? Call me up. I'll split. Well, I won't split on that sale, but we probably won't do another one. Okay, you see what I'm saying? I'm a little guy here. I'm not going to have an effect on George Bush, not going to call me up. You know, I did call my congressman, and I talked to those folks, and I expressed my concerns and asked them to do something. And I didn't follow the urban stuff. Okay, I would like to see on the active management area some things happen. But I love the wilderness. I go there every chance I can get. I love this place.
I'll give a little attempt at the politics question. One of my teachers in my work, John Osborne, he's a medical doctor, and I don't know if he coined the phrase, but he called it the iron triangle. If you envision at every side of the triangle, on one side is the Forest Service, one side is the timber industry, and the other side is God, I should know this. Congress, exactly. What you have is locked inside the triangle is our public lands, and you have influence and money flowing all around the triangle, and on the outside is the public. The decision on what is an active management area on the Bitterroot National Forest. Well, the forest plan, which was established in the late 1980s, how many folks in this room participated in that process? It's just a show of hands. 3 or 4, 5. That's a decision that needs to be revisited. I mean, the science has progressed a lot since the time we decided, the forest plan came up with the active management areas and what areas to be recommended for wilderness and what areas ought to be maybe restored. So before you accept the notion of an active management area, let's question that also. And who made that decision, and should we revisit that decision?
And I guess I just, I think a lot of this does come down to public process and democracy. We're dealing with a public agency. These are public lands. They belong equally to all Americans. The person up the East Fork who lives up there is an equal owner of that part of the Bitterroot National Forest with the plumber in Chicago and the hairstylist in Miami. That's the way these lands were set up. Everyone should have an equal opportunity to participate in how these public lands are managed. And quite frankly, what we see happening with the public agency and some of the public officials is mind-boggling. And I think if more people knew, for example, that the Native Forest Network on the Middle East Fork project, Supervisor Bull made a decision that all of our information that we request needs to be through the Freedom of Information Act. It's a lengthy process. It means that we get the information no sooner than 20 days. In fact, I have 930 pages right here of internal communications between the Forest Service, the logging industry, people on the Bitterroot National Forest, people with the Washington office of the Forest Service. I've only had an opportunity to look at about 150 pages. The manipulation that is going on by public employees of this public agency on this Middle East Fork project is astonishing, absolutely astonishing. To see a virtual purging of 28 documents related to soils, to see the manipulation of trying to circumvent the definitions and the guidelines that affect old growth and large tree retention as part of the Healthy Forest Restoration Act. It's amazing to see some of the communications between the logging industry and the Forest Service. We do not have that sort of a cozy relationship with a supervisor that apparently some members of the logging industry feel that they can express to the supervisor of the Bitterroot National Forest. Somewhere this is breaking down. Somewhere we need to have these public lands and these public officials held accountable. I'm not saying they need to do what the Native Forest Network or the Ecology Center wants to do all the time, or what the logging industry wants to do, but we need to have an open and honest debate and an open and honest public process. And it's broken right now. It's not broken on every forest. A lot of it, you know, dictates who is managing that forest and who's in charge.
Maggie, would you like to make this?
Yeah, I wanted to have the ray of sunshine in all this. You know, I wanted to get to, I don't really operate in the political arena much. I do tend to operate more in the realistic arena, which is where we see a lot of work getting done on the ground on the Missoula district and across the Lolo. And it is because of the National Fire Plan and the Healthy Forest Initiative that got people's energy rolling, and some of the things that we've done that have happened on the ground in spite of a lot of this other political discussion are things that have engaged citizens, that people have truly come to the table to say, you know, I'm interested in knowing not only how I can help in my backyard, but I'm interested in knowing how I can help in the Patty Canyon Recreation Area because I like to hike up there. I'm interested in knowing how I might be able to help over in the Superior area because my grandpa grew up over there. And some of the projects that are happening on the ground are things that have happened because of grants that were made available through the National Fire Plan and the Healthy Forest Initiative. And those things, you know, we have cooperative agreements with all the counties and rural fire departments in the state and the federal government that we pull together on projects that grants are given to us through the federal government and made available to communities where they can give the money to private landowners to do thinning on their property. Those things have been very successful because of some of this legislation and the administrative work. So from my perspective, there has been a lot of movement in terms of community involvement and in terms of citizen knowledge, in terms of how they can get involved. So I think for the folks that like you gentlemen up here mentioned about how does this relate to the common citizen, the politics of it may be overwhelming to some folks who work in that arena and who are more aware of it, but to people that on the ground that understand that thinning around their homes can make a difference and there are resources available because of some of this legislation, it's a helpful thing and it feels like the right thing for them to be involved in.
My name's Matt Arnold. I'm a forester, and I have a question for Jeff and Matthew. Jeff, in your opinion, do you think there's any place where you could see using some sort of commercial application to do thinning or tree removal on the national forest where you could see it as a positive thing?
Absolutely. I think we really have to start very close to where we're going to have the most effect for what our goals are with the project. And I think the most legitimate goals right now, given the lack of budgetary power, is helping people feel more comfortable with where they live, and that is make sure that the areas around their land and around their homes and other valuable structures on land of all ownership is given the best opportunity to survive a fire. I think we can limit that to a very small percent of the national forests, though, compared to what the agency likes to call the wildland-urban interface. But I think that also we have to admit that a lot of the goals we have there are not necessarily to restore the processes that Riley McClellan was talking about in the quote I mentioned. It's not restoring the processes, it's not working with those processes, it's leaving it a bit artificial. And if we go beyond that zone, then we have to be very careful to try to learn and work with those processes and keep those functioning intact pieces and processes and interconnections, this complexity intact as much as possible.
Matthew, I want to ask you a different question about your alternative. The 1,600 acres, does that include commercial type mechanical thinning? And if so, what type? What's the restrictions on that?
Well, when we put together the alternative and we submitted it, we're trying to do this with other forests and with other projects. We're really trying to look at this almost in concentric circles. If we're looking at a fuel reduction project, what is the type of work that needs to be done within what we're calling the community protection zone, which is this 400-meter zone around structures. Not 400 meters from the home, but from private land, private structures. With this alternative that we submitted and the Forest Service analyzed, we had no restrictions within that area. And in fact, the alternative that the Forest Service ended up developing, I think had, of the 585 acres that was in that area, I think 125 or so, they're going to do commercial logging. We didn't say to the Forest Service, no commercial logging in that area. We just said, do what you need to do best within that 400-meter zone to effectively protect the community from fire. Outside of that area, is where it gets a little bit more problematic for us. One reason is we think we do have, and Maggie can attest to this, limited funding, incredibly limited funding. And if anybody's paying attention with what's going on in Washington, the funding is for anything is going to be going downhill here sharply over the next couple of years. But the Forest Service simply does not have the funding to do the fuel reduction work, even tightly around those communities. So from our perspective, that's sort of the first tier of that concentric circle. Let's get the work done up the East Fork, up the West Fork, over in DeBorgia, up in Grant Creek, and let's see what we can do. Outside of that area, again, it's not the physical cutting of the trees necessarily that causes us the grief, but it's the soil compaction associated with the heavy sort of industrial equipment, which is where we coined the phrase industrial logging. It's log hauling on a road network that isn't up to standards that causes us some problems. It's the viability of old growth dependent species on these forests. So it's not necessarily the physical cutting of a tree. On that Ovando project that we did, that pilot project with Mark Vandermeer, who like yourself is a local small-time logging contractor, we just put boots on the ground up there, didn't run the heavy equipment out there. And Jeff mentioned the word sustainability before. We were thinking, wow, wouldn't it be neat? Some of the stuff that we did cut down for legitimate fuel reduction purposes did have commercial value. Wouldn't it be neat if we had an on-site sort of a small sawmill out there, and we could literally just take the wood out there with 3 or 4 people on these trees and get it to the small sawmill, mill it on site, let it dry out there, and then take it to the Ovando community or that area. So I think one of the problems we find ourselves kind of in shifting now to answering the question you asked Jeff is, given that I think we can all agree stuff that's going on the Biscuit and some of this sort of heavy-handed logging, that's a reality out there right now. How do we all work to stop that bad stuff from happening while promoting good stuff? And it's a chicken or an egg sort of phenomena. Do you work to completely end all sort of commercial logging on national forest and then build yourself back up to a level that the people who are the owners of those lands feel comfortable? Or do you simultaneously try and stop the bad stuff while promoting good stuff? There's probably not a one right answer on that at all.
How come when I talked about our solution, I think that Matthew and Jeff should be able to do their alternative. And I think the Forest Service should do theirs and let me do mine. Okay, and we'll see what we like. If you walk up to Patty Cake, go up to the end of the blacktop, stop the sweet smelling toilet, and hike out through the hills, okay? I'm paying the Forest Service $8.57 a ton to do the job. I've also reinvested $157,000 in trail and road work and $93,000 in brush removal. It's away from the site. It still makes money. Now that doesn't account for the analysis and some other things, okay? And it's a break-even deal for us. It's just not a get-rich thing, okay? And running $1.3 million through there, we're going to make $5,000 maybe if the price of fuel stops, okay? Because the log price has gone up and some other things, okay? So there is some benefit to the public there, and it didn't cost any money. You can lay them out so it spends a lot of money. You can lay them out so it makes some money. If you're going to make some money, you got to cut the big tree, a large tree, a medium-sized tree, some tree. It has to be a commercial thing. If you're waiting around for a handout from the United States government, the rest of the public, to do this, I can't do it.
I think the thing that to me that's most concerning with this discussion is that we're talking about federal public lands. And I feel it's totally inappropriate for the government to be subsidizing the logging, a resource that belongs to all of us, not just the timber industry. We've talked about win-win situations, but in this case, when we're logging old-growth forest, critical wildlife habitat, and in cases where they're trying to go into roadless areas elsewhere in the country, we're talking about a public resource that's going for product. At the end of the day, it's going for product. In this case, it's lumber. Should the taxpayer really be footing the bill for that? Absolutely not. This comes at an extremely high expense to all the other resources that national forests provide. And considering they're so hacked over, we've all been out in the woods and you know what I'm talking about, they're hacked over. What a new trend that's coming about is that the consumer is increasingly going to be aware of where the products come from. And I can guarantee you there's not many people that want to buy something that came from old growth forest. Who on earth wants to buy something they knew destroyed the Middle East for national forests? Virtually no one. The issue right now is no one knows where, people don't know that. That's a trend that's going to be changing. There's a huge growing trend in environmentally conscious consumers, and that means there's a huge niche. There's a huge business opportunity. And Craig, I have a question for you.
I'm all ears.
Or anyone else in the timber industry. Nationally, there's a growing market for certified lumber, especially FSC, Forest Stewardship Council, wood. Do you see that there's a growing market or opportunity for the timber industry and Montana to take advantage of this green market?
The green market actually is not growing as fast as what you're thinking. What happens there is everybody wants it if it doesn't cost them any more. But if it costs another cent more, they don't buy it. They buy the cheaper one, okay? And there's a tremendous appetite for wood in this country. My wife just printed out our Mary Kay stuff on paper, okay? Where'd it come from? We killed a tree to do that. Okay, she didn't use recycled paper, right? And look at the housing starts in this country. Are they up? Are they down? They're records, okay? The baby boomers are building houses. What are they building houses out of? Wood and concrete, which is the best? Ask Dr. Patrick Moore. He's got a video out. It's trees are the answer, okay? Look at the video. It'll be really good. He was the founder of Greenpeace. And he's now saying that trees are probably, for our society, the least impactable thing that we can work with, okay? And about you're talking about the public here. Okay, let's go back to the Healthy Forest Restoration Act. Remember that it is a bipartisan act that was put through Congress, passed by a majority of the duly elected representatives of the free society of the American people. They represent the American public. Okay? If you don't like it, call your guy.
I'm talking about consumers, though. They're a decision maker as well, and they've largely left out.
Oh, wonderful. I love talking about consumers because they're the one that nobody ever counts on, okay? And what they says is, nobody's going to buy this. Go down to Home Depot. Look at what they're buying. They're buying wood by the truckloads. They want this stuff. They're consuming it like wild. What are they saying? They're not out here at this meeting today. They're not out saying, Dave Bull, don't cut that tree. They're down at Home Depot spending their money on it. They're the silent majority. They want wood. They have a tremendous appetite.
They don't want it from a dangerous forest, though. If they knew where it came from, they wouldn't buy it.
No, that's not correct, because when you look at this, the Healthy Forest Initiative was put up by representatives of the duly elected public. They want it.
I don't think anyone here is under the illusion that the people in Congress always represent the wishes of the American people.
That's your first. I worked as a hydrologist on the Pittman National Forest for 5 years, and that's a whole other evening. But the reason I left the Forest Service was I saw a lot of schizophrenic foresters. And the schizophrenia in forestry right now in the last 30 years has been working in a culture where that culture wants as much wood as possible, as cheaply as possible, with virtually no impacts on the environment if we had a choice. And the schizophrenia in forestry right now is, how can we do that? So in leaving the Forest Service, I tried to commit the last 30 years of my career to being a green builder, to try to find a way of slaking the demand for all things, not just wood. But in this quest for finding softer, lighter, more environmental alternatives for essentially an unquenchable demand for all resources on the planet, I'm finding it very difficult to find alternatives that are better than wood. And the quest now then is, how can we begin with global climate change? And I'd love to see the connection, because I think the connection and the awareness of where things come from, where we take things from, is increasing among the public, but I'm holding my breath on that one, because we can't even make a decision on global warming. But I would like to put to you a couple of questions, because it affects locally things that are going on right now in our neck of the woods. And one is, with carbon sequestration right now, there's a whole bunch of concern among foresters and ecologists that young, rapidly growing forests may be our only choice outside of plankton in the oceans to sequester carbon. And old growth forests don't do that. If we can get beyond the emotion of old versus young, and I'm an old growth advocate, but I also see young, vigorous forests sequestering far more carbon than old ones, then how do we address that issue with our forests here? And then also, how do we address the 45 million acres in the northern Rockies of small diameter trees? Because that has a whole nother host of potential opportunities and also devastating results. So could all of you on the panel please address the carbon sequestration issue as well as small diameter utilization? And how do we go as a culture ahead and forward with these lessons for other countries as well as our own?
Speak with that. Well, we need to throw the bums out that are in power that make their wealth is based on fossil fuel use as quickly as possible, as much as possible, exploration, no limits. We cut these forests down and we ship them around with fossil fuels that are not being used sustainably. It gets back to the sustainable question. How do we address that? I think the mission of everybody in this room, whether you embrace it or not, is to find a way to transform society so it is sustainable. I don't know that transforming old-growth forests into young, vigorous forests is the solution. I think we have far better solutions that are a lot less risky ecologically and long-term economically by just slowing down, changing policies, stopping the waste of what we do and how fast we do it. It's a challenge. It's not easy. But I think we have to look at the whole situation there, not look at how necessarily forests will just alone deal with the global warming and the carbon sequestration issue. And I think that we have made that decision. The only people that haven't made that decision are in the Bush administration right now. And they happen to be the ones that control. And there are cronies in Congress that are also as corrupted by the money they get for elections.
In this room, tonight, among those of us in this room, I would like to have a more direct response to carbon sequestration and small diameter utilization. Instead of throw the bums out, that's a huge picture. We can all deal with that in another venue. But tonight, just for us here, could I have some more specific responses to carbon sequestration and small diameter utilization? What that entails. Thank you.
Well, Steve, I'm not smart enough to answer that carbon sequestration. I just had somebody tell me what that meant about 6 months ago. I do know, though, that the Forest Service at a national level has signed on in a big way to try to answer that question nationally as an agency and working with other countries. So I can answer it only in that perspective that I know from the ground level, the Ranger District level where I work, that is being talked about, and it's not at the point where it filters down to something meaningful for me on the ground at this point. So I bet you there's folks in the room that can answer that question from a larger perspective. On the small diameter question, I know that Craig will also answer this, and this does hit closer to home, because there are projects across the Lolo Forest and many other forests in the Northern Rockies where small diameter material is being utilized in every way, down to a 4-inch top and maybe smaller in some places, and the slash that's left is being utilized to heat schools, and many of those programs were made possible by the National Fire Plan. So the biomass program is growing. There's 2 more schools that have been added to that program in the last year alone. So that's Thompson Falls and Phillipsburg, if I'm not mistaken. So the small diameter stuff, if I can take it one step further, that this is a bit of a passion for me, and that is that if we are able to get our hands around this notion of treating forests in the urban interface and beyond for pre-commercial and non-commercial type of product, utilizing a lot of this smaller diameter stuff, going into a commercial scheme further out, and doing some mechanical treatment, and then utilizing fire to reintroduce fire to those landscapes, that to me is an attractive picture. And when we talk about reintroducing fire in the Northern Rockies, I get excited about it because the costs that it entails are much less than fighting fire. So I could end up talking for the evening about the costs that pertain to suppression costs versus utilizing fire for natural resource benefit. But back to the question of the small diameter stuff, I do think we're making progress in that. Maybe there's some other folks that can attest.
May I address that? Do you own any property with trees on it?
Yes.
Okay, how many acres? Have you been to the stewardship program? Okay, I would suggest you go. I would also suggest 2 other things. Read Mimicking Nature's Fire, Arno and Fiedler, and read, go get the Outside magazine, and read an article by Peter Stark. Starts on page 51. Might give you a little bit of insight. So for my thrust on, you're talking about the old growth. I don't want to cut all the old growth. Okay, I like big trees. I think we should leave some of them. I think that was a serious mistake that we made in harvesting in the past, is we kept the big ones and drove over the rest. We're past that. We could keep some of these big trees around, but we should have a random mosaic of different types of forest across the landscape. This will stimulate the smaller trees to grow, and we can utilize the smaller trees. I'm utilizing trees up there on that patty blue that you see, or we are, down to 1 inch in diameter. If I can get them to the grinder, I can utilize those. And like I said, the British thermal units there are for 1 ton of slice is equal to about 3 barrels of diesel fuel. Okay, so this is available, and it is possible in this right here in Missoula, Montana. You can drive right up there. We can, if your property is close and reasonably accessible, we could possibly do that on your property too. I'd have to look at it to see, okay? But if we had, say it was a portion of this patty blue, we can do those things there. We're leaving big trees. We're cutting the medium size and small trees, and we're thinning them out so that they will grow vigorously. We're removing the carbon, okay? It's in the small tree, and we're taking it and we're using it in another fashion, okay? And stimulating the growth of the other. So there is some possibilities along this line. Your question is probably bigger than me, but that is the portion that I can help with.
If multiple use wasn't a problematic statute enough, you went through a carbon sequestration. We do have time. We do have time for a few more questions, but I would ask, given that we are running out of time, if we could make them as pointed as possible, directed at the panel. And if you do have a comment, try to make it snappy, perhaps. I wanted to hit David, and then Jim Birchfield, and then we'll arm wrestle.
Okay. Well, I feel like underlying so much of this is the roads issue, and we're not maybe addressing it as specifically as we should because of the amount of roads that are on our national forest and the ecological problems that they're causing, and the incredible fragmentation you can just imagine when you think about enough roads in the national forest across our country and back and forth. And, should we be talking about logging of any type, small diameter, anything, thinning a young stem that we're all being motivated about, without talking about road removal?
I guess that question kind of ties into the small diameter question as well. You know, from our perspective, the road system, we have about 440,000 miles of roads on our national forests in the country. The Forest Service is the world's largest road building entity. Go across the equator 18 times, circle the globe 18 times at the equator. Right now, just a maintenance backlog, not a restoration backlog, but just maintaining those roads. Right now, the Forest Service is approaching a $10 billion, with a B, $million road maintenance backlog. What we find, and we're starting to talk with other researchers and scientists about this, is whether you're cutting small diameter trees or trees that have been killed by a wildfire, green old growth, dying trees, in-between sized trees, if you're hauling them on a road system that isn't properly maintained, that is dumping sediments into the streams, you're going to have serious problems with sedimentation, which is affecting water quality here throughout the West. So it kind of ties into both the question that Mr. Logan asked as well as yours. That's the roads are a huge issue. You know, the past Forest Service chief said we could remove half of the roads on our national forest, about 200,000 miles, and still maintain the same level of access. Just because a lot of times these are either roads to nowhere or they're just doubled up. Anyone who's been out in the forest sees the sort of road building binge that took place from the 50s until the early 80s. So you know what I'm talking about. So roads are a huge issue. The Forest Service doesn't have any money necessarily to even maintain the roads they have. They're still building new roads, they're building permanent roads, they're building some temporary roads. And you know, some people in the logging industry would like to say, well, then you can cut some trees and pay for roads, or you can cut trees and pay for restoration. Maybe that'll pay for 2 or 5% of what needs to happen, but you know, it's going to require an expenditure of taxpayer dollars to deal with the road system on our national forest.
Right.
The road system was set up for basically logging, right? And it provided access in some other deals, but it was primarily a logging thing, okay? And it was set up that if you maintained the ASQ on the forest plans as we are now, they'd be able to maintain the road. But they're not meeting their ASQs, so they don't have any money, okay? So now you have to go beg Congress for some money. So that may justify that some of these roads need to be put away, but it cost about as much to get rid of it as it did to make it. It's a lot of money, okay? Probably you're going to have to bring them up to BMP standards to just do anything. And if you're going to do any of these activities, if you're talking about moving these little trees, you're talking about chip vans. They got to have a high-class road. We can't get around on a logging road with a chip van. We've come up with a couple of solutions of that, but primarily you're going to have something else. You're going to have to reinvest some money in there. The sedimentation, let's address the sedimentation. You're talking about, what, there's 12 tons per mile or something? What's happening? 158 tons was going to come off of the East Fork, or what were those figures that you had?
Well, 158 tons currently are dumped into the East Fork watershed as a result of roads.
On the Middle East Fork analysis area? Or
no, within the entire East Fork watershed. The Middle East Fork analysis area is just a part of it.
Okay. 158 tons. After the fires of 2000, I went and down and did a little study since I'm a doubting Thomas on the North Fork of the Rye. In 1 mile stretch there, after running some transects, I came up with 1,890 tons of material went into the stream that I could identify, and probably 2/3 of that, 2/3 more than that went on down. So what's that, 6,000 tons or something? And if you go up and look in Laird Creek up there, if I went up there with a D10, I couldn't push as much stuff that went in there, all right? The fish weren't killed by sedimentation, they were killed by crushing and grinding. And if you talk to the fish biologist down there, the stream, what is it, 5 years, we're the 6th season now? The stream fish count is up to where it was before. Is it that big a deal?
Maggie, would you like to respond?
Yeah, on the Lolo, you know, it's true that the cost of restoring roads, obliterating roads, replacing culverts and bridges because of the sediment issue is really expensive, and it doesn't pay for itself. And we aren't cutting the timber in these areas like we used to pay for those types of projects. But we are committed at every turn to be able to take care of those best management practices, if possible, before we go in and do any of the the work that we plan to do. And so we try to build that in ahead of time. And I think that we're doing a lot better, and our commitment to that is that we will take care of those BMP projects before we go in and take care of if we have a timber harvest or other projects in that area. So I think you'll see some improvement in that area. I also agree with Matthew. What he said is that it's problematic to how we pay for some of this restoration work. We do have some project proposals on the Lolo that we would like to restore some of the territory where we think that there's some problems with sediment, and we do want to close some of those roads, but how to pay for it is an issue. And so we're trying to work in partnership with Jeff and Matthew and some other folks on the Upper Lolo watershed in particular to look to how we can fund closing some of those roads when it's not associated with a project that would bring in revenue such as a timber sale.
Jim?
You know, although I think that conflict can be something creative and productive, I would really like to see us, at least in this room, bury the hatchet and start working on the problems that we all agree on. And I think there's a lot of agreement on things that we can do in the forest. And I really agree with this gentleman down here about the political dimensions of this. And I guess what I want to see more than anything else is an alliance between the environmental community, the small timber operators like Craig and Matt, and the Forest Service, all of us who care very much about the forest and want to see it thrive. I think that can happen, and I think we can defend the forest, but I think we need to concentrate on the things that we know can help the forest and help the communities, and there's a lot of room to do that, and we just need to kind of focus our efforts on those areas where we can be productive, like in the areas that Maggie has talked about, and the areas that we can make better progress on the Bitterroot and other forests. I want to see a Forest Service that thrives. I want to see a Forest Service that's transparent and working with the community. And I think that movement is happening, and I'd like to concentrate on that in the future.
Well, I think we should have maybe time for one or two more questions, and if anyone has any further questions, you're welcome to come up, and these guys around for a little while.
I'm willing to stay.
This gentleman's been very patient.
Well, I'm a third-generation farmer from western Montana, and I can tell you some stories about the 1910 fire that my mother told me, and they sunk very deep into my mind. And our place borders National Forest property. I have very deep feelings towards our place. I'm more of an environmentalist than most environmentalists in this room. I put a conservation easement on it to keep it from being subdivided. I feel that strongly. I wanted to devalue the price of that property so we can keep it. So my question today is to the panel, how can we private landowners who have timberland in western Montana that want to keep it sustainable, to pay our property taxes, to keep it as good property for our future generations, how can we use the Healthy Forest Initiative and the HFRA to perpetuate our legacy?
Well, I can start, and you folks may have other answers. I'm not certain where your piece of country is.
Border of the Kootenai. Thompson Falls and Trout.
Okay, and so in that particular area, I'd encourage you to go into the Ranger District. Are you right there at Trout Creek, in that area? And see if they have a community fire plan system set up, and if they don't, perhaps they've got some grant opportunities with their cooperative kind of agency, fire protection agreement, or their agency there. That's where folks in the Missoula area have benefited, that they've been able to work within that cooperative agency grant process through the HFI and the National Fire Plan to get grants that are sustaining over a few year period of time, that a landowner can come in and they will be paid to be able to take out some of the trees and have things thinned out and have the work being done for them through probably the Montana Conservation Corps or any number of other groups that do that type of work. So I'd encourage you to start there for those types of grant opportunities.
Great.
And yes, as a private landowner, I could consult with you and take you to several places where we have done what you're asking and show you examples, and you can make a choice. I would also very strongly suggest that you take the stewardship advisor course, or so I think it's from MSU, is that right? So that you could get a handle on what you actually have. What they try and do is empower you with knowledge so that you can make a decision that fits your particular situation. Okay?
I've got enough experience I can teach you.
Okay, right, that's fine, that's fine, okay. So then, if you know that much, why don't you do it?
I'm concerned about other people too, but I'm also concerned about the partnership between National Forest and private landowners to sustain the healthy forest.
Maybe I'm mistaken, but isn't there some money through the Healthy Forest Restoration Act that, and through other acts of Congress, something to do with replacing the county payments, that helps public, well, maybe there should be, but there's ways that there is budgetary power through the Forest Service. It's just not emphasized very well to work with private landowners. I'm so glad to hear of examples of people who are trying to sustain the land and what's on it. And I wish you luck with that. I don't know enough about, and I hope Maggie can answer this in the greatest detail about what kind of opportunities there are, and maybe they're too lacking with HFRA.
Yeah, no, you were on the right track, and it's essentially what I just mentioned, that those grant opportunities are available through either the private landowner themselves or through this kind of community fire protection association, and that's what we have in Missoula, and Granite County has the same thing. And these the HFRA and the HFI also, some of these new authorities that we have allow us to go into areas adjacent to private landowners. Some of the CE authorities allow us to get in there without the lengthy administrative review process. And so that's what some of that is relating to. So we do have some flexibility now that we didn't used to have. We may see some of that change in the next few months as a result of some of the recent discussion we've been having publicly. But I would start there locally